main event of the evening. Hey, what's up, y'all? It's Preston again. But yeah, this is my prediction for Edgar Berlanga versus Hamza Sheerahs, which I don't know why the fuck this boy Edgar Berlanga got the main event over Shakur Stevenson. All because of, like, I ain't gonna lie though, if it wasn't for Canelo, he would have not got the main event. But I feel like that still isn't enough for him to get this main event. I'm just saying, and shit like that. Even though it's a good matchup, and shit like that, But that's the thing, though, and shit like that. But Edgar Berlanga versus Hamza Sheerahs. This is a good fight. This is a pretty damn good fight, and shit like that, in my opinion. Definitely a pretty good fight, and shit like that, because Edgar Berlanga, and shit like that, he is actually getting a lot better. He's actually starting to become more confident in his abilities, knowing that he's not knocking everybody out in the first round anymore, and shit like that. Even though he's able to stop people, but he's not knocking people out in the first round no more. So it's like he's learning how to box, move his feet, and shit like that, utilize the jab, and shit like that, and do what he need, and basically, he's a good boxer, but he gets hit a lot, and shit like that, Edgar Berlanga, and shit like that. But he manages to know what he needs to do to stay active with his punching, move around, and shit like that, cut the angles out, use the jab, and shit like that, and then, and obviously he has his power. Overall, we all know that Edgar Berlanga has very big power, and shit like that, ferocious power, and shit like that, and that's the thing and shit like that, like, I wouldn't, like, but the thing is, though, like, this is what I say, power or power for Edgar Berlanga. I would probably say he got power, not necessarily to put people to sleep or to just, every time, like, he could use it in any fight for him to stop somebody, and shit like that, so I would say he got power, but he got some big power. I would say he got more big boy power, like, that's what Berlanga got, and shit like that, and that's the thing and shit like that, and basically, like, that's gonna be a big factor, for him in this fight, and, his pressure fighting, and shit like that, but Hamza Sheerahs, he's a scrap artist, and shit like that, he utilizes his distance with his jab, and shit like that, but then most importantly, he'll be, like, he just throws his hands. It could be from the outside, it could be from the inside, it doesn't really matter for Hamza Sheerahs, and shit like that, as long as he's in his right mindset, and shit like that, and that's the thing and shit like that, But yeah, and shit like that, as long as he's in his right mindset, and shit like that, because, like, because I still haven't seen that fight with him and Carlos Adames, which I do need to rewatch that fight. I need to rewatch that fight, and shit like that, but a lot of people are saying that Carlos Adames won that fight, and shit like that, clearly won that fight, but it was in Saudi, so that's why they gave it to, that's why they gave it to Hamza Sheerahs, and shit like that, but yeah, and shit like that. Let me light this real quick. But what these fighters need to do to win this fight. But yeah, shit. But what these fighters need to do to winning this fight. We're gonna start off with the favorite of Edgar Berlanga, or actually, let me look. Is he the favorite? I need to look at the odds. Oh, shockingly, Sheerahs is the favorite. But I'm just saying, though, but a lot of people are kind of, like, a little bit siding with, like, at least from what I've been hearing, siding with, like, with, well, I mean, like mainly, like, like my dad, and shit like that, but also some YouTube channels, they're picking Edgar Berlanga because they just think that going up to super middleweight is doing too much and shit like that or whatever, and shit like that, but overall and shit like that, like, I feel like Sheerahs looks bigger than Edgar Berlanga, and shit like that. Berlanga is always like a thick muscled dude, and shit like that, he's like basically kind of fat, and shit like that, like he usually is kind of like kind of has that like chubbiness and shit like that, so it's like That's the thing. But if you look at Sheerahs, like he put on that weight, and shit like that, and that's the thing and shit like that. But I'm gonna go quickly, into what he, yeah. But basically, with with Sheerahs, he just needs to be able to utilize him to be able to throw his hands, not be cautious, and and shit like that. But I think I've already said that for everybody, for all of them, and shit like that, But either way, this is how I see the fight. The early rounds and shit like that, I see the early and mid rounds being a tie, and shit like that, But honestly, man, I'm going with Hamza Sheerahs, bro. I think Sheerahs gonna take the fight, man. And shit like that. It's gonna be a good fight, but I just like, Edgar Berlanga, man, like I just feel like he's just a face, bro. And shit like that. He's more of a face than actually like, a real fighter, and shit like that. Like that's the thing. Is obviously he's a real fighter, but more of like as like like a high level fighter. Like I really feel like that Hamza Sheerahs is gonna like, even though Sheerahs like he has some things he needs to work on, but I mean he's gonna show that there's levels in boxing, and shit like that, to Edgar Berlanga, and shit like that, And I don't know, man, you could like, I wouldn't even be shocked if he stopped Edgar, and shit like that, But overall and shit like that, it's like, I don't know, man. You know what? I'm gonna go with the stoppage. I think he's gonna get this big mouth motherfucker, Edgar Berlanga, who like to say nigga all the time and shit like that, acting like he's cool and shit like that. And you ain't black, but I'm just saying, and shit like that, But yeah, and shit like that, So like, overall, I'm picking Hamza Sheerahs by a stoppage in this fight, and shit like that. And I think Hamza's very frustrated. He knows how big of a mouth he is, and shit like that. I don't even know why fucking Shakur Stevenson is even acknowledging this dude on anything and shit like that, obviously people say what they say, and shit like that, but it's just more of like, he says it way too much, like it's just more of like, I'm just saying, bro, and shit like that, just like, sometimes, as a black person, when somebody says it, like, it gets offensive, like, and shit like that, like, it gets more offensive than, like, but I don't know, man. Maybe Edgar Berlanga, like, if somebody, called him like a bitch ass nigga or some shit, he would get really mad at it, like, especially if it was kind of racial, or if somebody called him like a racial name, basically what black people will get told and shit like that, he would stand up for it. You never know, man. But I'm just saying though and shit like that, but it's just more of like, it's just like, at the same time though, there's a level of respect that you gotta have for fighters, and I just feel like they were like doing too much and shit like that, in the press conference and shit like that, like not even Floyd Mayweather was like, Floyd Mayweather was just all talk. Like, he never threw things at people. Only if you did something, threw something at him, that's when you would get money made, like he would get pissed, and shit like that, and that's the thing, like, it's just like, come on, man, and shit like that, like, this isn't the UFC, dude, like, literally, it's like, it's like, these people are, like, these niggas are, like, almost, like, 30 years old and shit like that, acting like 12 years old and shit, like, get the fuck out of here, and shit like that, like, literally, and I am just saying, and shit like that, but yeah, but overall, I got Hamza Sheerahs winning this fight by a stoppage. Thank y'all for watching this video. Make sure you guys like and subscribe. Peace out, man.